Have you ever looked at an old photo or video of yourself and physically wanted to disappear? Maybe you see the way you dressed, the way you talked, the haircut you thought was a good idea, and you just think, why was I like this? The weird thing is, you probably didn't think anything was wrong with you at the time. You weren't walking around thinking, wow, I'm gonna regret this in 5 years. You thought you looked good. You thought what you were saying made sense. You were just being yourself. So why does that same person suddenly feel so embarrassing when you look back at them? There are actually a few psychological reasons for this. And the first one is probably the most obvious. You've changed. Psychologists use the term self-concept to describe the way we understand and define ourselves. It's basically our mental picture of who we are. Our personality, our values, our beliefs, our interests, the groups we identify with, and the kind of person we think we are. And the important thing is that this picture isn't permanent. You have new experiences, you meet different people, you develop new opinions, you prioritize change. Sometimes you even become almost unrecognizable compared to who you were a few years earlier. So when you look at an old version of yourself, you're not judging that person from their own perspective. You're judging them from yours, and that's a huge difference. Imagine you find a photo of yourself from 5 years ago wearing something you absolutely loved. At the time, you probably thought, yeah, this looks great. But now, you look at it and think, who let me leave the house like that? The photo didn't change, the outfit didn't change, you changed. And now you're looking at that old version of yourself through a completely different idea of who you are. But there's another reason your past self can feel almost like a stranger. It's something psychologists call psychological distance. The basic idea is that when something feels psychologically distant from us, we tend to think about it in a more abstract way. And time can create that distance. Think about something you did 5 years ago. You probably don't remember every tiny detail of what you were thinking, what you were feeling, or what was happening around you. Instead, you might just have this general image of yourself. Yeah, I used to be like that. And because so much time has passed, that version of you can start feeling like a completely different person. It's almost like you're watching someone else's life, except unfortunately, the person is you. And there's something even stranger about the way our memories work. We tend to think of memory like a video recording. Something happens, your brain saves it, and later you press play. But human memory doesn't really work that way. Our memories are connected to our sense of identity and to the person we are in the present. So when you remember something from 5 years ago, you're not simply replaying the exact experience you had back then. You're remembering it as the person you are today. That means the same experience can actually feel different years later. Maybe something that seemed completely normal at the time now seems ridiculous. Maybe you used to have an opinion that you can't even understand anymore. Maybe you remember a relationship, a friendship, or some embarrassing phase of your life and think, how did I not see this differently? The event hasn't changed, your perspective has. And that brings us to another psychological concept, self-discrepancy. Basically, we don't have just one idea of ourselves. There's the person we believe we actually are. There's a person we would ideally like to become. And sometimes there's also the person we think we're supposed to be. And when there's a big gap between these versions of ourselves, it can create uncomfortable emotions. That's why looking at your past self can feel so strange. You're comparing that person to who you are now. Maybe your younger self was more immature. Maybe you dressed differently. Maybe you cared about things you don't care about anymore. Maybe you behaved in ways that completely contradict your current values. And suddenly you're thinking, I can't believe that I used to be that person. The cringe isn't necessarily about the individual thing you did. It can come from the gap between who you were and who you believe you are now. And there's another ingredient that can make this even worse. Other people. Embarrassment becomes much stronger when we think we're being watched and judged. If you do something stupid alone in your bedroom, you might laugh about it. But if you do exactly the same thing in front of 50 people, suddenly your brain is preparing your funeral. Research on embarrassment has found that believing other people are watching and evaluating us can significantly increase how embarrassed we feel, especially when we think we've performed badly. And that might explain something about looking back at our old selves. We're not only remembering what we did, we're also imagining how that version of us looked to everyone else. You might watch an old video and think, why was I talking like that? But underneath that thought might be another one. Did other people notice how ridiculous I looked? And suddenly, something that felt completely normal at the time becomes painfully embarrassing. But here's the part I find most interesting. Maybe cringing at your past self isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it might actually be evidence that you've grown. If you genuinely wouldn't do it anymore, that's telling you something. Your values changed, your priorities changed, you learned something, you became more aware of yourself. You developed. So instead of looking at your younger self and thinking, why was I such an idiot? Maybe there's a better question. What changed between then and now? Because the fact that your old self feels strange to you can actually be a sign that you've moved forward. You don't cringe because your past self was necessarily a terrible person. You cringe because you're looking at that person with everything you've learned since then. And honestly, that's one of the strangest things about growing up. At some point, the person in your old photos stops feeling like you. But they were you. They made the mistakes. They had the opinions. They wore the terrible clothes. They made the questionable decisions. And whether you like it or not, they're part of the reason you became the person looking at those photos today. So maybe the next time you find an old picture and want to crawl into a hole, don't delete it immediately. Take a second. Look at that ridiculous version of yourself. And instead of asking, how could I possibly have been like that? Ask, what does the fact that I feel differently now say about how much I've changed? Because sometimes the person you're most embarrassed by is proof that you've grown.